Guidance is advised.
Welcome to Frankly Speaking. My name is Onkgopotse JJ Tawani. We're coming to you live from Auckland Park here at the SABC in Johannesburg. And tonight we focus on state-owned enterprises. These have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Corruption on one hand, poor governance, mismanagement, you name it, it is there. Can they be redeemed? The new Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, is my guest tonight to discuss these and other matters. But hey, last week was another interesting week in South Africa, isn't it? The Guptas in the news again. Are they citizens or are they not? Well, after the Minister Malusi Gigaba and the DG Apleni spoke, I still remained a little bit none the wiser. Well, let's take a look at some of the highlights of that story.
Insofar as we at Home Affairs are concerned, the two gentlemen are not South African citizens.
We can confirm that indeed a certain Abdul Gupta is properly registered at primary school in Saxonwold. In order for a person to register, you've got to be a South African citizen, and you've got to be in possession of either a barcoded ID or alternatively, you've got to have a smart card.
Minister Gigaba never dealt with the granting of citizenship to Abdul Gupta, who was naturalized on November 2002, having satisfied the ordinary residence requirements for naturalization.
Well, spare thought for my friend Maihlome Jwete, who has to spin all of that. You know, it's difficult, man, when you don't know who to believe. And of course, civil servants getting caught in the crossfire. You can follow our show on hashtag Frankly Speaking, as you can tweet us at JJ Tabani. You can also tweet at SABC online. Of course, you know, whether you believe it or them or not, we've got to talk to public officials. And tonight we're talking to former Minister of Finance, but current Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. Let's go talk frankly to him. Minister, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I know you're quite busy, and we really appreciate it for you to come and talk to the people here on Frankly Speaking.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You know, SOEs are complex structures, and like the Guptas, they've been in the news for a while, except that they're not registered in the Shebeen in Saxonwold. So,
look, you know, Saxonwold, I mean, 1 minute they say Shebeen, and now at least today they refer to a primary school, which gives us all hope. Are you happy to be back in cabinet, and were you expecting it at all?
Well, I was in Parliament and having great fun, but also great pleasure at making Parliament relevant once again, and the focus of public attention together with colleagues in the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee. And the public must compliment the leadership of the Portfolio Committee for livening up Parliament, for holding public officials to account, and also bringing out the truth, even if that truth meant continuous denials. I don't know, I never knew, nobody told me, etc.
Others may think you had unfair advantage because probably half of the stuff they were telling you, you knew better because you're Minister of Finance. Half of the stuff had to do with procurement, had to do with how public finances were managed. Do you think that some of the stuff that came out of there, you could have picked them up earlier as a person who was an overall custodian of public finances and therefore clamped down to almost reduce the extent to which there was so much that was going wrong, particularly on finances in those enterprises, Minister?
Well, the brief of Treasury is fairly narrow. It's to watch the finances of the state-owned entities. Secondly, as we began to get into fiscal difficulties, particularly after the recession in 2009-10, that impacted on our revenues and our ability to spend. Clearly, we had to be more mindful of the kind of bailouts that many of these entities were seeking. And in many instances, whether it's the SABC, by the way, or any of those entities, conditions were attached, both by the relevant minister and by the Treasury, for funds or guarantees that were given at the time. What we did pick up are certain procurement maladies, but we didn't quite put the whole picture together in the form that it later emerged, particularly as a result of the emails.
But would that sort of put a question mark on the strategy to have a central procurement system? You had somebody called the chief procurement officer, and God bless that guy, because essentially he was expected to have an overall view of what's happening in procurement. So with Eskom having asked for a 23 billion rand bailout at some point, surely one would argue that the systems should have been in place much better to ensure that that 23 billion isn't wasted, while in fact you are dealing with a crisis, to try and make sure that Eskom remained liquid, Minister.
Well, again, on the Treasury side, we had a very limited view, and that office, the Central Procurement Office, was just about being set up at the time. Its powers have been slightly weakened, and I'm sure under Minister Nene and President Ramaphosa, those powers will be strengthened once again, because many of these entities had the right to even say to the Treasury, sorry, we're not giving you this information, or we're not sharing that forensic report with you, and those sorts of obstructive tactics. But it's the Department of Public Enterprises, currently under my responsibility, that must actually develop more effective oversight over not just finances, but the operations, both on a governance point of view, but also what happens in those entities at a day-to-day level.
Yes.
And that's our job over the next year or so.
A lot of people were surprised that SAA was placed under Treasury instead of under Public Enterprises. And what you've just mentioned now would mean that SAA would miss out on that oversight by Public Enterprise. Would you argue that, first of all, whether something like SAA should be under Public Enterprises, or in fact, maybe you would argue that you don't need a Department of Public Enterprises and particular line functions must oversee their relevant SOEs? What would be your overall approach on something like that?
I think that's part of the review that the President, I think, is initiating of number of cabinet positions, number of departments, which departments takes accountability for those respective functions. But there are many other things that we need to look at carefully as well, particularly with President Ramaphosa's emphasis on implementation. So policies are fine, and many departments have got used to the idea of formulating policies, but it's the effect on the ground, it's the impact it makes on the citizens of this country, but also all the maladies that seek to penetrate what we actually try to do. So maybe that's a question in a year's time that needs to be addressed. I think our immediate concern is to get the governance right, as the President says, make sure we have effective management teams, effective and honest boards, because this criminality, allegedly, or let's say malfeasance, has crept, as you know.
We'll come to that, because I want you to give me an assessment of what you think is going wrong with the SOEs after the break. But before we go to the break, did it mean that if you had SAA under Treasury during your tenure, you needed then to have aviation experts in Treasury who can oversee? Because how do they oversee this massive multi-billion entity that's dealing with a specific subject matter called aviation, if indeed they are not experts themselves?
Well, there's three issues there. The first is the financial issue, which the Treasury had competence to deal with. The second is the strategy of an airline and whether it's effective enough to become self-sustaining. And the third is the governance. And as you know, for some time, there was an insistence that Ms. Mieni remains the chair of the board. And
you battled to get rid of her, even after 5 billion loss.
Well, that's for history to record.
We're going to talk after the break on your assessment of what are the big, 2 or 3 big themes that have occurred to you as you are, getting a handover on public enterprise, but also as someone who has been dealing with these enterprises a little bit. We're talking to Minister Gordhan, who is the newly appointed Minister of Public Enterprises. After the break, we continue that conversation.
for round 2? Voltaren, now available at your nearest store.